Welcome back to The Report. In tonight's feature discussion, we look at the plight of the Indigenous First Nation peoples in Canada. Canada's Parliament met in an emergency session this week over a rash of suicide attempts by Aboriginal teenagers in the remote poverty-stricken community. Afzal Ahmed has this report.
Over the past weekend alone, 11 people of the Attawapiskat First Nation in Ontario tried to commit suicide, prompting its leaders to declare a state of emergency. This follows a total of more than 100 suicide attempts over the past 7 months in a community of between 1,500 and 3,000 people. Children as young as 11 years old were among those who attempted killing themselves during the past few days. The incident shocked the country, with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who called the suicide attempts heartbreaking on Twitter.
That all parliamentarians, all 300...
He took power last year, promising to improve Aboriginal living conditions. The Canadian Parliament also held an emergency session last night, where they said that the rash of suicide attempts was completely unacceptable and vowed steps to keep it from happening again.
If we're talking tonight, is we got to get our heads outside of Ottawa, because the bureaucrats and the ministers and politicians will make it all sound great, but on the ground, those dollars are not helping in the way they need to help, and that's what I'm asking my colleagues to work toward. Can we find a way to break through that so that the people who need it are actually getting the services that are required to save the children and give them the help?
We will be looking at the health gaps and finding out what it will take and what kind of investments will be required to ensure that all Canadians enjoy the health that they deserve.
But the question is to every one of us, are we ready to help? Are we ready to do something, every single one of us, so that we don't do this in another 28 years, we don't have this debate in another 8 years? So that's my question for all of us, not for the ministers. Thank you.
The federal government and other authorities have sent 18 additional staff to Attawapiskat, which includes counsellors, mental health workers and police who have been carrying out 24-hour patrols. Tragically, incidents such as these in this community is not uncommon among Canada's 1.4 million Aboriginal community. The reasons for the attempted suicides are varied, but local leaders point to an underlying despondency and pessimism among the people, as well as an increasing number of prescription drug overdoses. Living in isolated communities with chronic unemployment and crowded housing, some young Aboriginals, while lacking clean water, have easy internet access, which gives them a glimpse of affluence in the rest of Canada. It is this disparity is what is most evident in the community. Resident Jackie Hukimawit, whose teenage niece committed suicide last autumn, hopes that new steps by the government are not in vain.
I wanted to share is about Sheraton, because I feel that almost that she's forgotten. I don't want her death to be in vain. I want something meaningful to come out of her death, that other children don't have to go through what she went through.
Attawapiskat has since 2006 declared 5 states of emergency. Residents in this community will be hoping that this will be the last. Afzal Ahmed, The Report.
Well, joining me to discuss the situation in Canada by Skype is Emma Davie, who's a freelance journalist. And on the line, we're joined by Dr Pamela Palmater, who's Chair of Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University. Welcome to the programme, both of you. Emma, poverty, discrimination, not news stories for Indigenous peoples. Why has there been this spike in suicides just now?
Well, I mean, the spike isn't just now. This is something that's been happening in Indigenous communities across Canada for years. And in Attawapiskat, this is something that they've really been trying to advocate for a long time that is an issue there. The big spike, I mean, they have a severe housing crisis there. It's a small community of, about 2,000 people. There's kind of this sense of hopelessness that they've been saying for years. Look, we need help. And apparently it needed to kind of get to the place that it is now, where, there were in March 28 suicide attempts, 11 in April. I think Monday night even there was a suicide pact that was broken up, thankfully. But these people have just reached a breaking point, and it's, finally time for the rest of the country to take notice and do something about it.
Dr Palmater, has this had the effect of kind of forcing the political authorities to take this more seriously?
Well, sadly, the only thing that forces the federal and provincial officials to even look at the issue is when the media highlights what's happening, because this has been happening all across the country. I mean, some First Nations have 40 suicides in a year. Some have a suicide every 6 weeks, and the ages of the people are getting younger and younger. And historically, First Nations have tried meeting with federal officials, writing letters, asking for assistance. They've tried declaring states of emergency. They've even tried protesting. But every single successive federal and provincial government has consistently turned a blind eye to the issue, relying on the fact that this will only be in the media for a week, and then next week it'll be about housing fires in First Nations, and the week after that it'll be about kids in care, and they can really avoid dealing with the issue.
Emma, is there any chance that it will get a different response this time round? I mean, I only saw the clips that we heard there of the debate that the politicians were having about this, but I've got to say it sounded a bit sort of hand-wringing and like pretty much business as usual.
Yeah, well, they've sent now, the health minister, Jane Philpott, has sent 18 health workers to go and kind of deal with the crisis there. But I mean, again, that's a Band-Aid solution. They'll help for a small period of time, and then what? I know that last year there was a range of stories in the media about murdered and missing Indigenous women, which has been a huge thing for a long time that people have just kind of been ignoring. And there is now like an inquiry in that, and I'm hoping that we see the same for this situation, that it's not just swept under the rug and that people do start taking it seriously. Because, you know, if it was a non-Indigenous or non-Aboriginal child, you know, 9 years old who committed suicide, that would be a huge thing that people would really be upset about. But for whatever reason, we seem to be ignoring these Aboriginal communities, and I think, you know, enough is enough. So hopefully, yeah, the government is able to actually make some real change and not just continue with the Band-Aid solutions.
Dr Palmater, I mean, if something's going to happen out of a government, it's going to be out of a Trudeau government, isn't it? I mean, it's probably the most progressive government Canada's had in a long time. If they aren't going to do anything, not much chance any other government would, is there?
Well, and that's the worry, because no previous government has done anything liberal or conservative. And what really concerns me is in the debate last night, you know, I had the Liberal government saying, you know, this is a big problem, it's very complex, it's going to take, you know, a lot of time, a lot of stall tactics, whereas the Conservative minority were all trying to blame the victim. This is about money mismanagement, this is about poor leadership, and so we're getting trapped into their own political agendas and really ignoring what's happening here. And they had a chance with the recent federal budget to address the discriminatory underfunding of essential human services like food, water, housing, and healthcare, and they didn't do it. So it's one thing for this government to have very progressive words and be very nice and say all of the right things, but the proof is in the pudding, and their budget didn't step up, and so far nobody has come up with a comprehensive plan to deal with this, because you have to keep in mind, Pikangikum is one of the neighboring communities for Attawapiskat, and Pikangikum has a suicide rate that's the highest in the world and has been for over 20 years. And nothing has happened. So sending a few, you know, healthcare workers to Attawapiskat might deal with the situation on the ground right now, but it's not dealing with any of the underlying root causes like lack of water, lack of housing, lack of education, lack of health care, and you know, they can't even control their own lands or be in control of their own lives, while there's a diamond mine right beside that community, which is making literally billions of dollars off of their territory. So the issue isn't one of remoteness or no possible economic sources. It's that they're consistently denied access to their own lands and resources to control their lives.
Emma, this is a community that looks as if it needs to get some political leverage. Does it have allies? Does it have supporters? Does it have people acting in solidarity with it in the wider society?
So there MP, he's an NDP MP, Charlie Angus. He was the one who was speaking at the debate last night. He, has been a great advocate for that community, but I mean, he's one person, and he's been saying for years, like, listen, something needs to change, something needs to be done to help these people. And I'm hoping that now that he's kind of had the floor in Parliament and is now in talks with the health minister, that, a change really does happen. But there are a couple of other, from the community itself, there have been people who've been very outspoken, but again, these are just, 1, 2, 3 people who are pushing and trying to make a difference and have been doing so for years. And hopefully now, it'll actually, a change will come from that.
Dr. Palmater, what is the sort of response of the wider community? Is there a sort of sense of solidarity with the Indigenous communities, or are people more likely to take the line which you were describing earlier of the Conservatives saying it's all their own fault, they're mucking it up for themselves? What's the kind of atmosphere around this issue across Canadian society?
Well, and here's the positive thing, because not only are First Nations and other groups standing beside Attawapiskat, but we have a large number of non-government organizations, human rights organizations, anti-poverty organizations, and Canadian citizens all across Canada literally offering whatever they can do to help in terms of support or putting pressure on government. For the last week, I've been getting tons of emails and copies of letters from people trying to put pressure on MPs. So I don't see the problem as Canadian society as a whole. It is the people who are in power who are making the decisions to not act. And this is what we need to get across to Canadians. And many of them don't have the facts. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that everyone has the facts so that we can get some action. The United Nations has told Canada in the last 10 years through numerous reports that they're violating every human rights code that there is in its deplorable treatment of Indigenous peoples. And in fact, the Special Rapporteur, James Anaya, said that First Nations live in abysmal poverty, third world conditions, in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, who get their wealth from Indigenous lands and resources.
Emma, you said that what they're doing at the moment looks like a Band-Aid solution. What would a more fundamental solution look like?
We can't just focus on Attawapiskat right now. Well, we have to right now, and I'm glad that there are, emergency resources being sent there, but it's a systemic problem. Like, it can't be just this one community, this one reserve that we're looking to help. It has to be all of the Indigenous communities and all of the reserves across Canada, because it's happening in all of the provinces. In British Columbia and Manitoba, we see very similar things, high suicide rates. I read somewhere today, actually, that, it's Indigenous youth are 5 to 7 times more likely to commit suicide than other youth. And this is something that's happening across the country. So if we're going to fix what's happening in Attawapiskat and make it an actual solution, it has to be looking at, Indigenous communities across the country as well.
And what kind of resources would be necessary?
So some of the big things right now is just that there's such a lack of medical care, police resources. Just your fundamental housing is another big one, because we've neglected these people for so long. It really, and I think the other important part of this is that we need to be asking these communities as well what we can do to help. There was a group of, I think it was 2 nights ago in Attawapiskat, young people in the community got together to have this kind of brainstorming session, and they had these lists of what do we have here, what do we need, who can help us get what we need. And the fact that young people in that community can sit down and do that and say, here are resources that we need, such as we need to have a gym here, we need to have activities for young people so that they're not just sitting around in despair, and we need to get access to better housing. Like, they've already taken the first step in doing that, and it's incredible that such a young community and such a young group of people can do that, and yet our government is not able to do that.
Dr. Palmater, we're running out of time now, but just let me give you the chance to answer the same question. What would a real solution look like?
Well, at the moment, we need an emergency management operation, a team of federal, provincial, and First Nation governments and experts to really issue all the time, resources, and people needed to deal with the multiple overlapping crises, be it, water, sanitation, suicide, housing, and that kind of thing. But the other really important thing is to address the very overt racism and discriminatory laws and policies in this country. If we just go and cure these children for suicide this week, but leave them homeless and without health care the following week, nothing will have been accomplished.
Okay. Dr. Pamela Palmater and Emma Davie, thanks very much for joining me for that discussion.